Welcome to Radicalize Me. If you like what we do here, help us out with a like, comment, subscribe, and if you're feeling real passionate, you can even donate on Patreon. The philosopher David Bentley Hart once said that Americans are the most thoroughly and passively indoctrinated people on earth. Since the Russian Revolution just over a century ago, United States news and entertainment media have trained Americans to fear anything even slightly reminiscent of socialism or communism, often used interchangeably, to support the military no matter what, and to believe the U.S. is the best country in the world. I came across an interesting example of this indoctrination when I visited my parents recently. Not from my parents, that's another conversation entirely, but on the first night I was there, we sat down to watch some TV, for old time's sake. I quickly vetoed Dr. Pimple Popper and the other gross medical oddity shows that apparently all retired people watch, and we settled on an 8-part CNN docuseries called History of the Sitcom. The series looks as far back as the 1950s up to shows on the air today. Each episode had a theme related to common types of sitcoms and tropes: family, friends, sex and relationships, and so on. But naturally, the ones I was most interested in were Working for Laughs, which was about workplace sitcoms, and Moving On Up, or the social class episode. I also liked the race episode, Facing Race, which I'd recommend watching, but is not my area of expertise. Although, of course, racism and other social justice issues are inseparable from labor issues. Working for Laughs was the first episode I watched with my parents, and as the talking heads reminisced about sitcom depictions of work over the years, I noticed a narrative start to emerge. The early examples, of course, showed men, largely white, at work or leaving for work or coming home from work. I Love Lucy showed Ricky Ricardo, sometimes at work, sometimes at home. Same with Father Knows Best, Dick Van Dyke, Bob Newhart, and so on. But as time went on, every change in American work culture was reflected in the sitcoms of the day. The 60s saw the passage of the Civil Rights Acts, making life somewhat more navigable for black people, so we see successful black families on The Jeffersons and later The Cosby Show. More women entered the workforce in the 60s and 70s, so that's when you see Mary Tyler Moore and Murphy Brown do their thing, right? The financial crises of the 70s brought shows about struggling families like All in the Family, Sanford and Son, and Good Times. But almost any show you can think of stayed firmly within the accepted range of political opinions for the U.S., sometimes known as the Overton window. Sure, there's a challenge to the status quo in The Jeffersons showing a rich black family on TV in 1975, or The Mary Tyler Moore Show depicting a successful working woman in 1970. Or even showing a black family struggle on a show like Good Times was not always something you got to see. Hell, even The Honeymooners from 1955 was about a struggling working class family. But all of these shows and their contemporaries stop short of critiquing the system itself or proposing any solution beyond the individual success of the characters in the show. Even the financial crisis era shows rarely talk about how things could be different politically, opting to stay within the narrow spectrum of everything sucks for the family and the family gets a stroke of luck. Maybe you're thinking that I shouldn't expect anything more from US sitcoms, and that's fair, but we can still learn something from a closer look at how these shows do and don't talk about socialism and class politics. So here is part 1 of probably a 2-part series: the 3 best sitcom depictions of socialism. Here's how I judged best. 1. Does any character mention socialism or communism? 2. Does any character correctly identify a socio-economic problem and at least imply an anti-capitalist solution? And 3. Are other characters receptive to these ideas? If not, which side is presented as reasonable? The first example is a decent Seinfeld episode from 1994 called The Race. I'll briefly explain this episode for anyone unfamiliar. Jerry is dating a woman named Lois, which is funny because, you see, he likes Superman.
Jimmy's in trouble, Lois.
Lois's boss is a guy who Jerry raced in high school. In that race, Jerry accidentally started running before the gym teacher said go, but denied it. The guy always suspected Jerry cheated and has been challenging him to a rematch for 20 years, but Jerry chooses not to run.
Because I choose not to run!
Boomer comedy. What are you going to do? Meanwhile, Elaine is dating a communist named Ned, and they order a lot of delivery from this racist caricature of a Chinese person. Kramer and Mickey work as a mall Santa and an elf, respectively. Ned converts Kramer to communism, and Kramer starts preaching on the job. Mickey and this kid hate communism. Also, Steinbrenner sends George to Cuba to negotiate with Castro and get Cuban baseball players signed to the Yankees, because apparently that's how that works. Overall, I think this episode was just meant to be a lighthearted take on communism and the fall of the Soviet Union, which is generally Seinfeld's MO. The show and the guy both tend to avoid being explicitly political, but based on this episode, I can't help but think Jerry and Larry David were at least a little sympathetic to communism, or at least had a couple of writers in the room who were. I say this because the communist characters in the episode, Ned, Kramer, and apparently Lois.
He's going to fire me.
He can't do that.
Yes, he can. He controls the means of production.
Are the only ones who make anything resembling coherent arguments. The arguments are definitely played for laughs, but that is what you do when you're trying to sneak real political points into comedy. So again, while I probably wouldn't say the show is explicitly pro-communism, it is interesting that characters make these communist statements that just hang in the air, and no character ever makes a counter-argument. The most we get is Mickey and the kid at the mall getting angry when it's mentioned. Otherwise, all the jokes made at the communists' expense are ridiculous to the point of absurdity. Like Ned insists on only wearing drab clothing. It's kind of funny, but if they really wanted to ridicule communists, they could have at least made him insist on only wearing union-made clothing or only stuff made from sustainably sourced material and just present that as the annoying trait. From purely a comedy writer's perspective, I'm glad they avoided the cliche, but when I examine it further, I think the way they wrote this belies a more sympathetic or at least more playful relationship to the topic. Another example of this absurdity is Kramer explaining how there would be no delis under communism because the different meats are like social classes.
There are no delicatessens under communism.
Why not?
Because the meats are divided into a class system. You got pastrami and corned beef in one class and salami and bologna in another.
So you can't get corned beef?
Well, you know, if you're in the Politburo, maybe.
I could see some Ben Shapiro type maybe actually saying this seriously today. But again, as part of a Seinfeld episode, it doesn't even come across as a criticism, and they're clearly just fucking around. Meanwhile, what we do see is Ned competently explain to Kramer that his employer is abusing him, and talk about the U.S. blacklisting of communists in the 1950s, which his father experienced firsthand.
When my father was blacklisted, he couldn't work for years.
Kramer tells one of the kids he meets as Santa that the toy he wants for Christmas is made by child sweatshop laborers.
I want a racing car set.
Listen, you don't want that. Those are assembled in Taiwan by kids like you.
This guy's a commie!
Well, that's enough, Pinko. You're through!
That's true of a lot of products sold in the U.S., and this fervently anti-communist child has nothing to say besides, this guy's a commie. And if this line is any indication, Lois has a decent grasp on the Marxist critique of capitalism.
He controls the means of production.
To go back to our list of criteria, does any character mention socialism or communism? Yes, this episode has characters talk openly about communism.
This is Ned. He's a communist.
Does any character correctly identify a socioeconomic problem and at least imply an anti-capitalist solution? Ned points out that the mall is underpaying and overworking Kramer and Mickey.
You know the Santas at Bloomfield's are making double what you are? When you get a rash all over your face in January, you think Coleman's will be there with a medical plan? Kramer, I've got some literature in my car that will change your whole way of thinking.
Talk to me, baby.
Listen to him, Kramer. You got a good job here.
There's just no way you could have beaten me by that much.
Kramer mentions child sweatshop labor in third world countries, and Lois uses the language of Karl Marx to describe her boss's authority. Are other characters receptive to these ideas? If not, which side is presented as reasonable? True to Seinfeld, Jerry is unbothered.
Wow. A communist, that's something.
Elaine just has a morbid curiosity.
Oh, whoa, a commie.
George embraces communism for self-serving reasons.
The Daily Worker has personals?
Yeah, and they say that appearance is not important.
Yours or hers?
And Kramer fully buys into the ideology. Ned is presented as a level-headed, principled person who knows what he's talking about. Kramer is presented as, well, insane because he's Kramer, but nothing he says is incorrect. Mostly. Anti-communists, like the kid at the mall and Kramer's boss, are presented as paranoid and overreacting. While Lois's boss doesn't talk about communism, he is presented as unreasonable and unfair, threatening to fire her if Jerry won't race him. This fits pretty neatly into the episode's running theme about labor rights. Second on our list is Aliens, a 1992 episode of Roseanne. If you're any younger than I am, you might not have been aware of Roseanne during its original run, and it's possible you only know Roseanne Barr herself as the aging, racist, Trump-supporting comedian who had a horrendous downfall a few years ago during the short-lived revival of her show. Honestly, she's probably in serious need of mental health care that I hope she's getting, and while it's unlikely, I also hope she's no longer racist. However, back in 1988, she had a show with pretty based working-class politics. As far as I know, Roseanne was a pretty revolutionary show at this time. If we look at the other sitcoms on the air in 1988, they're all about middle-class or rich families. Cosby Show, upper middle class. Golden Girls, middle class and rich. Who's the Boss? Rich. Dear John, rich people. Growing Pains, upper middle class to rich. Wonder Years, middle class. I could go on. But Roseanne the person seemed to make a very conscious choice to center her show on a struggling working-class family in the fictional town of Lanford, Illinois. And the show doesn't just give you a vague sense of, oh, times are hard. It illustrates the inescapable, compounding nature of poverty in America. The Connor family doesn't simply support each other through the bad days, though that element certainly exists. They bump up against the system in a way rarely shown on TV at that time, and even now. A great example of the show's attempts to fully pit the system against this family comes in this scene from the episode Aliens. The only context you need here is that Roseanne's husband, Dan, just got a call from the bank because he's late on the loan payment for his motorcycle mechanic shop. Roseanne's about to lose her job, and then there's a knock at the door.
Hi, I'm Mike Summers, your state representative. How you doing?
Already, this scene is perfect. We never find out what party he is, but this smug fuck strutting in with his slim fit outfit and the jacket over the shoulder, he could easily be a young, shitty Democratic Party pretty boy upstart like Beto O'Rourke or Pete Buttigieg, or a young, shitty Republican Party pretty boy upstart like Marco Rubio or Tom Cotton. This guy would definitely have campaign ads on TV where he's on some staged factory tour with his sleeves rolled up and a hard hat on. God, I hate him.
Great.
Good. I'm going door to door trying to get to know my constituents.
Door to door, huh? Why don't you just go down to the unemployment office and see everybody at once?
I'm not really a filmmaker, so I don't do much technical critique, but I know enough to know when a scene is staged well. His posture is so on point, and then Roseanne stands there with her arms crossed and just the right amount of attitude. So Summers tells Roseanne that he's aware of rising unemployment, and that bringing in new business is his number one priority so that Lanford's workforce doesn't lay idle. Roseanne isn't buying it.
We're going to make it cheaper for out-of-state businesses to set up shop right here in Lanford.
Well, who's going to pay the taxes that they ain't paying?
Well, you will, but you'll be working.
This has been the U.S. government's go-to lie since Reagan was in office, and we're still hearing it from both parties today. Tax incentives, of course, are just a way for corporations to further maximize profit at the expense of American workers, who they lock into poverty and wage slavery. But I'll let Roseanne explain.
Union wages?
Well, now...
So they're going to dump the union so they can come here and hire us at scab wages, and then for that privilege, we get to pay their taxes.
Is your husband home?
Let's make an official judgment. Does any character mention socialism or communism? Strangely, no. But given the time period and that the show was set and created in the U.S., It makes sense that the working class Connor family would have some kind of class consciousness while not espousing socialism by name. This manifests as Roseanne calling out the state reps' pro-corporate, anti-worker policies and inquiring about union wages. Does any character correctly identify a socioeconomic problem and at least imply an anti-capitalist solution? Yes. Roseanne has a solid understanding of the scheme at play, where the politicians literally shift the tax burden from corporations and the rich to the working class. She also, again, reveals her union support in this conversation. You could go full communist and argue that unions aren't quite anti-capitalist because they're kind of just a necessity under capitalism and don't fundamentally alter the employer-employee relationship. But I'll say this, capitalists sure don't like them. And we got to start somewhere. And later in the episode, Roseanne also literally chases Rep Summers out of her husband's shop in an attempt to continue talking his ear off. This is an indication of her desire to take politics into her own hands by scaring elected leaders into action. She wants to make his life hell until and unless he commits to doing better. That ain't liberal shit. Are other characters receptive to these ideas? If not, which side is presented as reasonable? Summers is the only one who rejects Roseanne's ideas in this episode, but he is 100% portrayed as the villain. In fact, his inclusion in the episode comes across as purely an excuse to have Roseanne sound off about the plight of the working class. His presence led to 2 funny scenes, and it's connected to their money troubles in the episode, but they easily could have just made an episode about the Connors' money problems with a bunch of jokes and call it a day. Roseanne doesn't really talk politics with anyone else in this episode, but it's important that they didn't have any characters try to talk her down at any point, besides Summers, of course. It's especially noteworthy that her husband, Dan, doesn't talk her down at all. Like, hey, come on, he's an important guy. Don't you think you're being a little unreasonable? Which is, I think, what most sitcoms would probably do if they even allowed a woman to talk shit to a state rep at all, right? It's amazing what happens when you actually let women produce, star in, and write shows. The last positive example, at least on this list, is from a 2002 Bernie Mac Show episode called Mac Local 137. The Bernie Mac Show starred the late great comedian Bernie Mac, known for his stand-up and film roles such as in the original Kings of Comedy, Friday, and Ocean's 11. The premise of the show is that when Bernie's sister in Chicago enters a drug rehab facility, she needs to send her kids, Vanessa, Jordan, and Brianna, to live with Bernie and his wife in Beverly Hills. As the title suggests, he plays a fictionalized version of himself. In the Season 2 episode, Mac Local 137, Bernie notices his yard in disarray, including the grass, flower beds, and the fence, and realizes these are the results of his nibblings playing, perhaps a bit carelessly. Bernie is understandably annoyed and tells the kids they have to clean up the yard. However, when they find out they won't be getting extra allowance for the extra work, they go on strike. At first, I was going to say this is not a perfect metaphor because we're talking about kids and their guardian, in this case their uncle, and the dynamics are different from a workplace. However, Vanessa does make an important point about the extra allowance.
Jordan and Brianna are goofing off. I should get more money.
What money?
The extra allowance for extra work.
Extra money?
I don't think it falls under child labor to make your kids do chores, but if you establish in your house that the kids will do certain chores for a certain amount of money, then extra chores should mean extra money, even if it's to clean up their own mess or whatever. I say this not just because I'm me and I don't think the nuclear family unit should enforce the employer-employee dynamic in the way school and fucking everything else does in a kid's life, but because capitalist-minded parents like Bernie Mac's eponymously named character claim that they want their kids to understand the value of $1 and know how to put in a hard day's work. If he wanted to teach his nibblings how to work, he should teach them how to properly value and take pride in their work, not just how to accept abuse from their employers. No job can legally make you do anything off the clock, especially if you're paid hourly. I don't know the personal political views Bernie Mac himself held in life, but I certainly question the motives of the character for dismissing Vanessa's reasonable argument and then having a slave driver fantasy that does not hold up well, in which he forces the kids to work at gunpoint. Sadly, I fear that this scene might have been an attempt to reach racist white suburbanites and middle Americans who only respect black people who have the same fucked up oppressive values they do. Now, perhaps I've overindulged in conjecture, but these contradictions also make me doubt the real-life suburbanites who would likely go a similar route as Bernie did in this episode if they were in the same position, but who might couch their decision in more of this teaching my kids the value of labor bullshit. Of course, these are usually the same suburban parents who then go on to use their connections to get their kids into all the best schools and internships that'll fast-track them into high-paying jobs and positions of power so they can continue this cycle of abusing their kids and looking down on manual laborers and poor people in general. But I digress. What's interesting about the Bernie Mac episode is he's fully honest about his intentions and interests from the beginning. He is full capitalist from the jump and doesn't care who knows. The episode starts, as most do, with Bernie giving his confessional/exposition to the audience, but this time he's reading the newspaper. He comments on how bad the stock market was at that time.
This year I got killed in the stock market.
I don't know a whole lot about it, but the market downturn of 2002 was bad enough that it has its own Wikipedia page. I was around then, but I was more interested in the Bush administration's war crimes. Teenage boys, right? By the end of the episode, Bernie levels with Vanessa and explains that he just wants the best for her. He also points out how much he gives her in terms of her basic needs and wants just because she's part of his family, and all he asks is that she contribute a bit. Classic sitcom shit. This scene serves to soften Bernie as a character and his relationship with his niece, but it also addresses my first point that the dynamics in a family unit are different from a traditional employer-employee relationship. Ultimately, this scene is fine. Again, I don't think it's wrong to ask your kid to do some chores, but I wish it had made clearer that Bernie provides for his nibblings because it's the right thing to do, not conditionally as long as they do housework. I'm sure he would always provide for them and wouldn't let them starve because they messed up the lawn. But I wonder whether focusing more on the virtue of taking care of each other rather than the virtue of working yourself to death might make it easier for people to scale up the idea of caring to the rest of society. Maybe Americans wouldn't be so goddamn scared of Medicare for all if our media promoted the idea of general welfare as a human right. It's in the Constitution. Hey, Editing Joe here. I'm aware that there's a lot of debate over what that general welfare thing in the, not only the preamble, but in the 10th Amendment itself, I believe, means by general welfare. I'm not super interested in having that debate. But I know that it's debated. So, feel free to comment whatever you like, but I will probably not respond, except to say now that I think that this probably does allow the government to do some healthcare stuff, and even if it doesn't, I think that would be a generally good idea. And if our Constitution prevents us from enacting good things, it's not the craziest idea to think about changing the Constitution. Other countries do that sometimes, and if our Constitution is actively making life worse for many people, that might be one of those times. Okay, back to the video. Let's make our judgment. Does any character mention socialism or communism? Not by name, but interestingly, the Bernie Mac show was the only one so far to mention capitalism. Bernie praises capitalism by name, And the show then pits the kids in opposition to capitalism by engaging in labor action. And while just having labor unions under the current capital-owning model is not itself socialism, you can thank socialists and communists for making unions a possibility. Does any character correctly identify a socioeconomic problem and at least imply an anti-capitalist solution? Yes. The kids, or Vanessa at least, have a solid understanding of the contradictions at play in their arrangement with Bernie. If a certain amount of work gets them a certain amount of pay, more work should get them more pay. And Vanessa understood that the kids would have to stand together and go on strike in order to get fairly compensated. Once again, a lot of well-meaning liberals will tell you that, well, labor rights aren't anti-capitalist, it's just fair. That's how capitalism's supposed to work. Bullshit. The capitalists want it all every time, and they'd step over your dead body for just a little bit more of it. People, it's called capitalism. They are in the fucking name, not you. Are other characters receptive to these ideas? If not, which side is presented as reasonable? The fact that Bernie's wife sits him and Vanessa down to negotiate not only demonstrates a very positive and supportive relationship with her niece, but it's an analog for a positive view of labor rights. While children need guidance from their parents or parental stand-ins, it's good to give them some agency and take their concerns seriously. And while workers benefit from certain amounts of direction and structure or management, we are entitled to ownership of the means of production. And if it is not given to us, we must take it. As Chairman Mao said, change must come through the barrel. Ultimately, Bernie is not presented as particularly reasonable. Neither is Vanessa, and I might be inclined to call this a cop-out. But to be charitable, I think the point of the episode was that family members should try not to be at odds in this way, even if it makes sense in a labor setting. That's all for this video. Can you think of any other positive portrayals of socialism and/or communism in sitcoms? Let me know in the comments. And stay tuned for the next video in this little mini-series where we'll look at the 3 worst portrayals. Donate on Patreon to get early access and keep the channel going. Thanks for watching. Bye now.